Hi, and welcome to Compassion in a T-shirt. My name's Dr. Stan Steindl, and today I have the great pleasure of speaking with Dr. Nadine Levy. Nadine is Head of Program for the Health and Social Wellbeing Program at the Nan Tien Institute. Academically, Nadine's background is in law and gender studies, and her PhD is in sociology. And she's also a committed Buddhist and is interested in the way that Buddhism and sociology can enliven one another. I met Nadine at the recent UQ Compassion Symposium, and I was very keen to get to talk to her and hear about her life-spanning experience of Buddhism, mindfulness, and compassion, and helping to cultivate compassion in others. So I bring you Dr. Nadine Levy. Gradually get started. So welcome to Compassion in a T-shirt. Although I'm not wearing a T-shirt today, I must admit, I'm wearing a linen shirt instead. Might have to be Compassion in a linen shirt from now on. Not sure, but anyway, yes, it's great to have you come on. And as we were saying before, we sort of, I'm not sure if we met very much, but we said hello at the recent UQ Compassion Symposium and your presentation there. But I wondered perhaps, whether we could begin with just hearing a bit about yourself or your work, or maybe your background as well, where you're coming from.
Sure, yes. I am someone who started my journey really towards compassion through Buddhism or Buddhist practice. And I came to Buddhism really early in life, actually, when I was a teenager, and then drifted away from it and studied law, of all things, practiced in the legal profession for a little while, and then decided that I wanted to go back and study sociology, which I did, which led to a PhD on spiritual communities and healing spaces, which was a real delight to be part of. And during that time was more and more involved in Buddhist practice. And in particular, I had a lot to do with the insight tradition, in particular the work of Jack Cornfield and Joseph Goldstein. And then I also started practicing in the Zen tradition too, and very inspired by Joan Halifax and a few other key Buddhist thinkers who have done a lot of work on compassion. And so I had the privilege of being in America for a little while and practicing with those teachers and getting more and more involved. From there, I was working at Adelaide Uni for some time as an academic in sociology and policy, and very interested in this concept of an ethic of care, which is something that came up in my studies quite a bit. And so this notion of like caring as a kind of policy approach was something that I was looking into more and more, and how to bring, I suppose, justice and compassion together in certain spaces, because sometimes they seem at odds. So very interested in that side of things, and got to teach a little bit in criminology and restorative justice, and that was a really fertile space for these types of discussions. And then after that, I decided that I wanted to flee the nest, because I'd been in Adelaide since I was very little, and had done my undergraduate honours and PhD, and then worked at the same institution. And so at that point, I decided that I was interested in venturing further afield. And it was kind of this strange synchronistic thing that happened, which was that I went to the Sakyadhita conference, which is the Buddhist women's conference in the Blue Mountains, which had thousands of participants, and it was a really like special experience for me. That was in 2019. And at that point, I was looking for work outside of Adelaide, and this institute came up on my algorithms, and I had no exposure to the Nan Tien Institute at that point, and I didn't even know they existed. And so I applied for this job, firstly not quite knowing who and what they were, and then I went and visited and realized that it's the biggest Buddhist temple in the southern hemisphere, in the middle of industrial Wollongong, so quite an interesting spot, and interesting history, Chinese Buddhist kind of history, and then an institute attached to it, which is a higher ed institute where I got the job, and I've been there for 4 years. So that's kind of my background. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. What a many and varied kind of path, but also with these little touch points along the way that kind of feel almost like, creating that direction and trajectory that you're on. Would you mind if I ask about you as a teenager? One of the things I've been sort of interested about is working with young people and exploring sort of compassion and maybe even compassion-based interventions. I'm sort of a clinician, I suppose, and have the sort of run compassion-based, especially compassion-focused therapy groups and so on. But sort of interested in how one might pique the interest of young people or teenagers and so on. I was just curious, what was that for you in terms of your interest in Buddhism as a teen?
Yeah, I think that happened at the same time as my awakening or interest in social justice. And so I can remember being quite young, maybe 13 or so, and reading about socialism for the first time. And at that point, I went to a local Amnesty International office with a friend and asked if there was any kind of volunteering opportunities. And so, and that was a really important moment for me, because I think, it dawned on me that not everyone experienced equality, and there were many people in the world who just by chance ended up in countries where, human rights and protections were not afforded to them. And I don't think I'd seen that till I was about 13. And so it had this really kind of emotional impact on me. And I remember a friend of mine and myself withdrawing all the money we had from our bank, which was something like $100, and going to Oxfam and handing it over. And so it was this real sense of, wow, all of a sudden I can see beyond myself, and I can see the world around me, and why am I entitled to this privilege and wealth and experience? So there was that going on for me at the same time. And then I think I came to Buddhism maybe partly through the kind of archetype of compassion, but also I was in Singapore at the time, traveling with my mum, who actually works in retail and was very keen on shopping. And I think in response to that, I was kind of anti-consumerist in a way. And I was in the hotel room and I was reading the Bible, which was on one side of the bed. And then I read the Dhammapada, which was on the other side of the bed, because you know how hotel rooms offer these religious texts, apparently. And when I read the Dhammapada, what struck me was it just made perfect sense. And there's this real theme in there of nonviolence and avoiding addressing hate through hate, etc. And so from there, I remember going to a temple in Singapore where there was an image of Kuan Yin, or Avalokiteshvara, which is like a female embodiment of compassion. And I witnessed these women at the bottom of the temple making food for the disadvantaged. And I remember feeling really moved by that. And sometimes that essence doesn't get translated into Western mindfulness. And what we see is something a little bit more clinical, and a little bit more modern. But I remember it was that kind of emotional reaction to caring and witnessing compassion in action that really propelled me forward as a teenager.
At quite a youngish age, really, 13, you sort of had this awakening, and it was sort of an awakening to the suffering in the world, which is, kind of profound, really, isn't it? But also moved you and moved you towards wanting to help, even in what ways you could, I guess, as a 13-year-old, giving your $100 and that sort of thing. Like you, not only did you awaken to the suffering in the world, but you felt also moved to, sort of act take action and get involved and sort of it's really, you know, incredible in some ways perhaps to think of that much younger you being, you know, so moved towards really what is kind of compassion. Later it became sort of this connection with that, and Buddhism became sort of clear to you as well, and the spiritual side, and what sounds like a very moving, practical, tangible example of what it is to act with compassion.
Yeah, and it wasn't
Inspiring.
selfless. Like I did, you know, I absolutely got something back from it in a sense. And I've developed community through being around others at Amnesty and through going to Buddhist centres, and meaning, I think, in a sense of being part of humanity in that broader sense. So it wasn't, I mean, a lot of people think of compassion as self-sacrifice, but it certainly didn't feel like self-sacrifice. It felt like self-enrichment, actually, at that point.
Yeah, so, you know, compassion is good for us on a few fronts. I mean, obviously, it's good to help others, and especially those perhaps who are disadvantaged, or you know, but also it can be good for the person who is being compassionate, and it kind of has that twofold benefit. Is it Matthew Ricard or something, I think, is who I heard saying something like that compassion has a twofold benefit. It doesn't have to be all about sacrifice in a way, and that social connection perhaps was a big part of one of the things that you got back. And what about the trip then to the States? Like those people that you mentioned, I mean, they're some of the very important teachers, I think, that certainly people that I know of as well, and have, I think in some ways I've mainly engaged with them on things like Insight Timer, or, you know, watched their YouTube, watched them on YouTube and that sort of thing. But yes, you sound like you had some direct sort of learnings from all of them.
Yeah, I was very into sitting retreats before having kids, and I sat long retreats actually at Jack's Centre in Spirit Rock for a month, and then a few retreats with him in Joshua Tree, and then going to Upaya, where Joan Halifax is in Santa Fe, and actually she was keen to be involved in my PhD study, so I was partly there for that, but also I sat with her, and I was really moved actually by all these people, because they are real. They're real, and they're very authentic. And I think maybe there's something about, you know, American Buddhism that means that they're not kind of, it never felt like they were floating above the masses or anything. Very personable, very real, very down to earth. And also seeing the benefits of practice over long periods of time, which I could really sense. Yeah, so I was at Spirit Rock, I was at San Francisco Zen Center for some time, and then I was at Upaya, and I loved it. And, you know, if I had the opportunity to do it again, I absolutely do it, which was actually the point that I was wanting to make earlier, which was the importance of traveling with children, because I think a lot of that awakening that I had when I was a teenager came from seeing different countries and experiencing things outside of my own culture. And so I often think about, you know, taking my kids back to, you know, places like America and India and all those places that have spiritual significance to me. And I hope to do that. But yeah, different phase of life at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah, it's actually what you said before about the genuineness or authenticity of those people. It is funny because from a distance, you know, I notice feeling a little bit of the celebrity of them or something, and that's probably a bit of a shame, because I suspect they don't really relate to that themselves. They probably don't see themselves in that celebrity light, even though they're kind of famous in a way, and it would be actually really special to spend some proper time, I guess, with them and getting to know them as actual people.
Yeah, I think that's one of the strange things about American Buddhism. I mean, pre-modern Buddhism involved a temple down the road where you'd wander over and speak to the teacher one-on-one, and there'd be a lot of opportunity for mentoring, but you didn't have exposure to all these different traditions. And this global world, which means the internet supports information spreading, that has resulted in these kind of celebrity Buddhist teachers or celebrity spiritual teachers, which feel very much at a distance. And I think that's really lonely and difficult for a lot of teachers, actually. Like I've heard a lot of teachers talk about the fact that it is hard to actually build relationships with people because they do project and idealize and expect a lot from these teachers who are, like you and I. And of course, they have a very strong spiritual practice, but it doesn't mean that they don't have their own foibles and, difficulties and suffering. And so I always try and keep that in mind. And I've done a bit of teaching myself in the insight tradition over the last few years. And I have noticed what that's like in not that I'm in any way close to anyone like that, but what I mean is every now and then when you show up in that capacity as a meditation teacher or a Buddhist teacher, you can sense a kind of projection onto you, and you feel a bit guilty because you realize, like, I'm not perfect, and I've got all these hang-ups and difficulties and neuroses in my own mind. And how much of that should I reveal and how much of that should I withhold? And so it can be difficult, I think, being in that position. Yeah.
It's a bit of a fine line between, as a teacher, sort of offering sort of insights and even inspiration or kind of aspirations maybe for people versus somehow the projection of celebrity and idolization a little bit, because you're certainly wanting to inspire people and at the same time stay very kind of level with them as well. The other thing you alluded to there was your own kids, and I had wondered just to myself whether you mentioned a little bit about how partly you rebelled a bit with your mum. She was more into the fashion and that sort of thing, and she was a retail person herself, and she loved perhaps shopping and so on. And there was a part of you that almost rebelled there. But it sounds like there was another part of your upbringing which really was the way that your parents took you places, I guess, was it? And there was a sort of a little bit of that exposed you to all sorts of ideas and cultures and places, and that bit was really kind of in line with where you ended up. You'd kind of like to sort of offer that with your own kids perhaps one day as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think I was raised by my mother and my grandmother, so two women, and they were refugees actually from Egypt, and so and Egypt was largely cosmopolitan, and so they lived in amongst a lot of different cultures themselves. My grandmother spoke 4 languages, including Arabic, French, English, Italian, and migrated here to Adelaide with quite a bit of difficulty at that stage. But I think they did have a sense of the broader world, and there was a real thirst to connect with people outside of Australia, and I suppose you always feel as a migrant somewhat out of place, so to gain a sense of belonging in the broader globe, I suppose. So I'm really blessed for that reason. And even though my mother was a shopper, she was also tremendously loyal and loving and connected. And so she had all these values that she brought to the table. It's just that her interests were a little bit different to mine, and she wasn't a serious reader, or she wasn't interested in intellectual ideas. So I didn't grow up in an intellectual family at all. So way more practical, ethnic, down to earth kind of family. Yeah.
But sort of worldly and a bit sort of interested and curious about the world and one's place in it. How old are your kids now?
Well, one is in utero, so I'm pregnant with my second.
Oh,
And I'm now referring.
congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. And my son is 7, so he ended up quite different to me. I decided I didn't want to raise him any particular religion, and it's partly because I strongly believe the Buddha wasn't a Buddhist, So for me, this isn't about a particular religious position, but it's about values. And so, and I also don't like to tell him what to think or even how to behave, really. I've just given him space to be himself. And I always joke that he's part comedian, part investment banker. And so quite different to me in a lot of ways, and like a total delight to see that difference as well. So, of course, he watches us and he watches how we live our life, but I've been really reluctant to impose mindfulness on him, even though I teach that, and even kind of a sense of morality, because I think he's coming to that through care and connection with his parents, and he's coming to that himself, which, I think is intrinsic, and that to me intuitively feels a bit better than extrinsic teaching around some of this stuff.
Yes, my daughter, who's 21 now, is doing nursing, and she, I think it was actually maybe last year in her first year of nursing, she came home one day and said, "Oh, they were talking today about compassion, and it was really very interesting, and blah, blah, blah." And she was telling, and I was like, "Freya, I've been talking about that for years."
Yes, exactly.
But there's something very special and important, I think, for all of us to be able to, kind of discover these things in a way for ourselves, a bit like you did in a way. You sort of, and you're kind of hoping for your son, for example, or your children to discover the things that really resonate with them, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And, if he does become an investment banker, I've got nothing against investment bankers. He might become a compassionate one. So,
yes. Well, yeah, I was recently at the Compassionate Mind Foundation conference in the UK, and there was quite a lot there about compassion in leadership and compassion in organizations and compassion in politics. And, it was sort of interesting to think about perhaps investment bankers or big business CEOs or whatever, and how we can start to, sort of infiltrate the boardrooms or something. But so that is interesting. So, tell us a bit about the Nan Tien Institute. Is that the correct pronunciation?
Yeah, yep, Nan Tien Institute, you got it.
Yeah.
So it's connected to the Nan Tien Temple, which I mentioned earlier, and it's connected via a bridge, actually. So on one side, we've got this really beautiful Chinese temple with all the dragons and the reds and the oranges, and it feels like being in China for a moment. And then you walk over the bridge and you come to the Nan Tien Institute, which is a kind of modern concrete building, quite beautiful. It won some architecture prizes in the shape of a lotus. And it feels a bit like being in a spaceship when you're in there, actually. And so this institute came about, I think, in 2011. And the idea was to offer Buddhist higher education, because there was no such thing in Australia at the time. There's Naropa in the US, and there's also University of the West. And then there are various Buddhist universities in India and in Taiwan and in China. And so the leader of this particular order of Buddhism, which is called Guan Shan, was he was kind of a rags to riches story, and a lot of not that he ended up rich, but he ended up rich in knowledge, and a lot of this came through self-education. So he had a real emphasis on educating people across the world, and he saw that as a pathway to liberate yourself from difficult conditions, and 2, to be able to embody Buddhism more fully. So he started a range of institutes and universities around the world, and one such institute appeared in Wollongong. And originally they were just kind of operating out of the temple with 10 students. And then eventually they decided to build some infrastructure and expand. And since then, it's grown steadily. And we now have a Buddhist studies program, a mental health program, a health and social wellbeing program, and next year we're about to launch an applied mindfulness, a grad cert in applied mindfulness. And what kind of makes this place unique, I suppose, is that it's all accredited by, you probably know this acronym, by TEXA, which is our government accrediting body in higher education. So it means that we're operating under the same rules or more onerous rules than universities. So a lot of people have gotten Buddhist education in different ways, like through, signing up for a free online course or going to a temple or sitting in a retreat, and all of that is absolutely worthwhile. But this institute brings it to the next level in terms of scholarship and scholarly study of these topics.
And so what would be your role there? What are your primary sort of focuses?
Yeah, foci.
Foci. I was trying to think.
I don't know. Just said educations. So I think we're on the same page. It's all good.
Yeah.
My primary focus really has been the health and social wellbeing program. And I'll also be looking after the applied mindfulness program, which is a bit of a baby for me. So birthing another baby. I've been wanting to introduce applied mindfulness as a grad cert for some time. So I'm really thrilled about that. And so I look after those programs and I teach into those programs. So I teach a course called Compassionate Work, which I mentioned in the talk at the symposium. I teach applied mindfulness for professionals, research methods, and then I do a range of CPD activities throughout the year, mainly grounded in mindfulness and compassion. And then, we've got a whole suite of kind of experts and sessional teachers who come and teach from their perspective. So we've got people who teach like mindful leadership, coaching and counselling, Buddhism and psychotherapy, these types of subjects. And so I have a lot to do with those individuals who are all fantastic, inspiring individuals, and we try and coordinate the whole program. Yeah.
And so where does, like, the compassion at work, for example, or other programs, like what's your take on compassion, and how do you kind of think about that or present it or kind of include it into the training?
Yes. Well, perhaps I hadn't given it deep enough thought 6 years ago, and it wasn't until I started to write this course that I opened up Pandora's box, and I realized that this was a deeply multidisciplinary, complex area of both scientific and philosophical knowledge. And so in writing the course, I realized, one, that I was under-equipped to teach from the perspective of the hard sciences, particularly the neuroscience of compassion. So I've gotten a few experts in. And in fact, your colleague James appears as a guest lecturer on that course, which is a treat to have him. And then I also wanted to make sure it wasn't skewed too much to the hard sciences. So I then incorporated a lot of, philosophical content and sociological content. And so really where I sit is more in the kind of sociology of compassion. And right now I'm doing a study on the pedagogy of compassion, so compassion education. And, just talking purely from a non-academic perspective, from my personal perspective, I think I adopt the Zen position, which is simply that compassion is automatic, is as automatic as moving a pillow in the middle of the night. And so that's comes from one of the records, one of the Zen records. And I just love that metaphor because it's so simple and it reminds me how natural helping others is. And so the idea is that, when you wake up in the middle of the night and you shift your pillow because you're not quite comfortable, it's so deeply automatic. And so I think, from a personal perspective, I try and just follow these automatic impulses in my day-to-day life. How can I help? Sure, I'll do it. If someone's running across the road and it's unsafe, I'll grab them. Someone needs food, I'll feed them. It's that simple, and we don't need to make a big deal about it. So that's the non-academic me. The academic me says, yes, we do need to make a big deal about this. And I'm very interested in the way we conceive of compassion, and who we think is worthy of compassion and who's not, how we conceive of suffering, how we construct suffering, what types of suffering are seen as really problematic and which aren't. I mean, for example, mental suffering never used to get much attention, and now the psychological turn has meant it's gotten a lot more attention. So you can see that politically and socially, we think about suffering in different ways and construct it differently. So I think thinking about all of this with students has been such a treat, because these are postgraduate students, reflecting on their own view of suffering and who is the deserving receiver of compassion, and how do I construct them. And, like we do a lot of work looking at humanitarian discourse, and we try and identify the difference between pity and compassion through those representations. And we look at altruism. So there is a lot there. And because I'm in this tradition of deconstruction through sociology, I love to pick it all apart. And, hopefully it doesn't paralyze people doing that. Sometimes it does, paralysis by overanalysis. But other times it can be really eye-opening, I think, to consider the fact that we're not, personally, I don't believe that we should be building an identity based on compassion or the sense of being a good person. I think we're a mixture of all sorts of things, like we have the capacity for cruelty, for love, for good deeds, etc. And there's something quite mysterious and unique about humans, something pro-social, I suppose, that allows us to care for people when they're in distress. Yeah.
Yes, I really appreciate the sort of moving the pillow. That is a beautiful metaphor, and there is a part of compassion that is, quite just so deeply a part of our humanity that it's quite reflexive sometimes. We just sort of respond to need by trying to be helpful in a way, and yet then on the other hand we have these tricky brains or whatever, and so yes, there can be, compassion is not boundless sometimes. There can be certain appraisals around deservedness, as you said, or is the person worthy of compassion or of good character, or is there suffering their own fault, or all sorts of things that we might that might become sort of blocks. I really appreciate Paul Gilbert's work on fears, blocks, and resistances. I think it's a really powerful idea, because in some ways working with the fears, blocks, and resistances is the work in a way, isn't it? Because then if we can move through some of that, then that more natural kind of unfolding of compassion sort of emerges from there. What
That's very optimistic, but I do agree, on a personal level, I agree.
Yeah. What made you say optimistic? I'd be interested to hear your thoughts or reactions there.
I think it's it's partly because I said before that I taught in criminology, and there's this kind of blank slate theory, which you might have heard of, which is that we're born with a blank slate. I don't believe that, and I think my son absolutely came out how he came out, but with a temperament, right? But the idea, and it's not to be kind of dismissed quickly, is that we can cultivate certain qualities and not others. And so the idea is that there's nothing kind of inherent within us, that these are qualities that get developed through environment and society, and it's a kind of iterative process that happens over the course of someone's life. And so a lot of criminologists think like this. They think that people who have come from difficult backgrounds, they behave in difficult and problematic ways, and there's kind of no hope. Like there's no sense of like, well, if we can just tap into their inherent compassion or their pro-sociality, we can solve this. And so I'm not saying I believe that, but I absolutely think we should think about it, because in Buddhism, people are very quick to claim that inherently we're good. And I think that's an optimistic claim. I think I believe it, but I always like to be a bit skeptical towards my own opinions, and leave that kind of door open that perhaps, we live in a society where we value good deeds and good actions. We've got a Judeo-Christian ethic by and large, and the sanctity of life is really important to us, etc. But we were born into a completely different society with opposing values, would we see much pro-sociality? And that's the question that I often think about. Yeah.
Yes, and there's sort of three bits in a way, isn't it? I mean, the first bit is we are born with a brain that really was designed over, I guess, millions of years to have a whole bunch of functions built in, really, that were, I mean, if you ascribe to the evolutionary model, that were built in to help us to survive, I guess, and survive long enough to reproduce and pass on those kind of characteristics or something like that. And so the first tricky bit is that, yeah, we're sort of born with that kind of brain that has actually a whole range of functions, including competition or even cruelty, but maybe also caring and compassion. But then we get born with our own specific little genetics and maybe strengths and weaknesses or temperament, as you said, and that can vary from person to person. And then things start to happen, and we get shaped by life experiences as well. So there's a whole sort of sequence of things that can kind of lead to who we gradually become, whether that be more kind of interested in compassion or otherwise. So I see what you mean, and there's a really great series of studies out of the University of Coimbra in Portugal, working with youths in detention, people young people who have sort of gotten in trouble with the law and to the extent where they're now, kind of in detention, and they did some compassionate mind training type stuff with them and found some really very powerful changes actually in those young people. So I think the optimism for me is less about kind of the things that have perhaps already happened, and sometimes more about what is possible, from here.
Yeah, I agree. Maybe this whole argument about whether something is inherent or constructed is irrelevant in a way. I think that we can get bogged down in those discussions, particularly in Buddhist circles and mindfulness circles. And I think what's important, as you say, are the conditions in the present moment and going forward that may, help affect someone's neuroplasticity and change their life for the better. So,
Yeah. Well, as Marcela Matos at the symposium presented, she presented those epigenetic changes, as a result of which, but I won't be able to, maybe you can summarize them, but it's quite complicated stuff. I'm still getting my head around the epigenetics of things, but it did seem remarkable that even at that epigenetic level, there are changes in certain directions when people are able to experience some of the compassionate mind stuff. Yeah. What do you notice in your students about blocks then? Like do you notice that there are certain common things or challenges maybe that that you face or that they face in cultivating compassion?
That's a really good question. Yeah, I mean, I think if I led with what the students told me, the main block is self-compassion. And so they always thought that the self was kind of out of the equation. And so that's why they're really touched by Neff's work on self-compassion, which to me is fantastic, but is kind of old news. It's like, oh yeah, of course, self-compassion is part of this, right? But for people who are coming to it for the first time, it means a lot to them. And so I appreciate that in your sphere, you talk a lot about self-shame and self-criticism. And I think that is very true of my students' experiences. And so the art, I think, is to move between self-compassion and compassion for others and not just stay in one spot. And so, from a Buddhist perspective, the idea of the self is not that concrete, it's impermanent. And so self-esteem has always been seen as, something really important, but not something that you can cling to for the rest of your life. It's changeable. And so if they can hold these ideas lightly around self-compassion and self-esteem and consider, others in their life, I think that's really wonderful, because there is a bit of a danger of kind of, if it's essentializing or it's getting stuck in one mode of thinking about compassion. So compassion becomes like self-care all of a sudden, and which is fabulous. Self-care is terrific, but there's no link to the outside world, if you want to call it that, or to others suffering. And so from my perspective, what concerns me often is that when you do live in a society where you're comfortable, not everyone is in Australian society, but a lot of people are, you can selectively switch off from certain forms of suffering and, take care of your own psychological health. But that seems a little bit kind of like a missed opportunity again for connection and meaning and feeling part of this broader humanity. And so, yeah, I guess I see the importance of both. I'm certainly not on the side of arguing against self-compassion. I think it's totally wonderful and it fills a huge gap. And I think we need to make that leap across to kind of, personally, I believe that like self and other is a false distinction, and that that there's a lot of people in my life in my own head, right? So I really like these theories of intra-psychic relationships. And so how I treat others affects my psychological health and vice versa. So I don't kind of see it as, this is my psychological health and you're out there. I see it as much more interconnected. And so I would probably work with my students to problematize this notion of self-compassion and think more about just compassion flowing from body to body, mind to mind, species to species. Yeah.
You mentioned much earlier Joshua Tree, and I've been there too. I went to a mindfulness-based relapse prevention retreat, which was a long time ago with Alan Marlett, Sarah Bowen, and their colleagues. But I also went and did the MSc retreat with Kristen Neff and Chris Germer. And one of the things Chris Germer said, which really helped me, and I've mentioned this before, but is that, in many ways, compassion is, kind of is towards living beings, that, that we offer our compassion to all living beings, and we're a living being too. And so really, self-compassion really is just meaning widening our circle of compassion to also include ourselves, kind of thing.
Exactly.
And that seems to fit with what you were saying, that to think of it as sort of two distinct or separate things, it's more just including ourselves really in our own compassion.
Exactly. And I think we're all skewed in certain ways. I think some of us are more other oriented. I find that in parenting, I'm so fixated on my child that I often forget to look after my needs. And so self-compassion is a great way to kind of redirect my attention. And then there's the other type of person too. Maybe I was that in my 20s, where I was kind of narcissistic in a way. And so I really needed to be able to see others and move towards their suffering. And so in a way, it's a kind of corrective, like where you place your attention and what you focus on, depending on the state of your mind and your orientation and predispositions, I suppose. Yeah.
Yes, it's sort of ever unfolding, and it's a little bit of a reflect, review, repeat sort of cycle of just sort of honing this compassionate motivation. And so one of the things I sometimes like to ask people, and I don't know, but would you have, say, 3 tips? Like if people are sort of thinking about some of the stuff we've been talking about and that you've been saying there, like what would be 3 suggestions or ideas or things to reflect on, or tips just for people making their way on their own compassionate journey? Does anything come to mind there?
Yeah, I'm going to have to condense what I've said. So I guess the first tip is what I mentioned earlier about it being self-enriching. And so it's pleasurable. I mean, it feels good to feed people, right? And so in the Jewish tradition, for example, you always leave a plate out and a seat out for a stranger who might come into your house and eat dinner with you. And so these acts where, we're incorporating people beyond ourselves or beyond our family and attachment figures is very enriching, and you gain all these experiences that you may not have gained, and understandings and insights and opportunities. And so in that sense, I think compassion is a really positive thing and an exciting thing that can bring you a lot of meaning. And so that's one tip. The other tip is that it's not about being a good person, right? And so it's not about being nice. And I think that was mentioned at the conference. I think we can get really confused between being compassionate and being nice. I think, often people are stuck in this people-pleasing mode for whatever reason. And that can be quite self-serving and self-absorbed. Compassion sometimes calls for more fierceness and boundaries in our life. And so that can be surprising in a way. You surprise yourself into realizing, wow, I acted in a way that felt quite firm and quite assertive. But I did it with a good motivation, and it feels good in the body to do that, not out of aggression, but out of compassion. So allowing for scope, I suppose, in your definition of compassion to include something more fierce, protective, bounded. Number 3, let's think of number 3. It was interesting. I was at a meeting with Joseph Goldstein last week, I think it was, and it was a kind of Q&A session. And someone asked him they said, I'm a Buddhist teacher. I really want to help people. How can I get more people into my courses? He was also a mindfulness teacher. And his response was super interesting. He was like, well, you don't actually know the implications of your work. So if you teach 1,000 people, you don't know how well that's going to be translated or transmitted. But if you teach one person, for all that one person could go and teach 10,000 people. So it's not about the outcome. It's not even really about altruism in a way of doing good in a broad sense, but it's simply about, he said, he loves the mantra, how can I help? And it's spontaneous and it's in the moment. And if someone doesn't want to hear you waxing lyrical about mindfulness or compassion, you shut the hell up, right? And so it is responsive to your circumstances, and you don't go in with some kind of preordained idea about what you're going to do for someone. So I think that's a little bit radical. And I love, there's also a book that I want to mention called The 5 Invitations, which you might have read, by Frank Ostaszewski, who is a Zen hospice worker. And he talks about the fact that when he was working with palliative patients, often he had to, ditch the Buddha and bring in Jesus, right? Because that's what made them feel comfortable. So that level of responsiveness and letting go of your own ideologies or philosophies or ways of, it must be like this, is a radical shift, I think, towards the other and towards attunement. So that's what I'd say probably. You just caught me off guard, so I'm just telling you what's coming to mind.
I love it. I mean, that's an incredible answer, to be honest. I really appreciate that. I did spring it on you, but yeah, I mean, compassion is enriching. It does feel good. You get a lot back from being compassionate, towards others and oneself, I guess. It's different from niceness or people pleasing. In fact, often it's very important for there to be good boundaries, and sometimes fierceness is a part of it. But from a place of compassion. And it's not really about the numbers. It's not really about the outcomes. It's just that sort of really kind of almost simple motivation. How can I help? And just being spontaneous in the moment. So those are really 3 beautiful tips. Thank you very much. I'll also put the book you mentioned into the little notes at the bottom of the video. How can people find you or engage with your work, or the Nan Tien Institute? Any suggestions there?
Yeah, thank you. So you can find me on the website, on the Nan Tien Institute website, which I'll tell you. And been doing a little bit of writing these days for The Guardian. So you might see me appear in The Guardian a little bit, and a few Buddhist publications as well. So just Google my name and those hits should come up. I have to update my bio and profile to include new publications. I haven't done that in a while, which would be smart. So the website is www.nantien.edu.au, and if you go to faculty and staff, you'll see my contact details and my bio.
Okay, that's really great. And I might have a look at The Guardian. Do you have sort of a profile on there, or is it more just sort of random articles?
At the moment, I'm just writing for an opinion section on spirituality.
Okay.
Yeah, and so I've written a piece on parenting and a piece on what's the first one on finding meaning, and then the next piece I'm going to write, I think, is going to be on self-compassion. So it's a bit of a regular spot writing about spiritual matters. Well, I hope it's going to be regular. That would be really lovely, because there's something about translating academic knowledge into popular consciousness. And it's amazing how people, they don't know what you're doing half the time when you're an academic until you write something quite simple for popular consumption. So that's been a treat. And, I love the fact that we're also able to do that as academics. So, yeah.
Mm. Oh, that sounds like a really wonderful thing. I'll check that out for sure. And I'll put all the different links in the notes below on the video and on the podcast. But Nadine, thank you very much for coming along and having a chat. I actually really, learned a lot out of all of that. And it does sound like you're doing really some wonderful work. So thank you and congratulations on all of that. And thanks for having a chat on compassion in a t-shirt.
Pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Wonderful. Thank you.